All right, good afternoon. My name is Cynthia Riccio. I am the Director of Programs and Planning here at the museum, and this is a great crowd, just saying. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. We are so happy to welcome author Kostya today on April 18th, the anniversary of the most famous horse ride in American history, to present little-known aspects of a beloved story in the ride Paul Revere and the Night That Saved America, based on his book of the same title, which is in the back of the room, and it is $20, and you may purchase it downstairs at the front desk. This event is part of NH250, New Haven 250, an ongoing series of programming developed by New Haven Museum to complement America 250, culminating with the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. The series will highlight inclusive, local, and lesser-known stories connecting past and present. Revere, a Boston-based silversmith, engraver, and staunch anti-British political operative, inspired the poem and legend of the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. But, according to Kennedy, the story of Revere's ride to warn of approaching British troops is deeper and richer than previously assumed. That night in 1775 was 12 hours that changed the world, Kennedy says. Revere was not the only rider that April night in 1775, but he was by far the most critical. The Patriot's best and most trusted express rider, he had already completed at least 18 previous rides throughout New England, disseminating intelligence about British movements. But this ride was like no other, Kennedy asserts, in its consequences in the months and years following as the American Revolution transitioned from isolated skirmishes to a full-fledged war became one of our founding tales. Kostya Kennedy is editor-in-chief of Premium Publishing at People Inc. and a former senior writer at Sports Illustrated. He is the author of the New York Times bestselling 56, Joe DiMaggio and the Last Magic Number in Sports, Pete Rose, An American Dilemma, and True, The Four Seasons of Jackie Robinson. All three won Casey Award for Best Baseball Book of the Year. He has taught at Columbia University and New York University. Welcome, Kostya.
Thank you all for coming out. It's amazing. This is the actual anniversary, and it's a good crowd. I sent a horseman out to say the Paul Revere talk is coming. The Paul Revere talk is coming. So I'm glad it worked. 95? Yeah. So it's great to have you here, and great to have you here on this anniversary. It was 251 years ago, of course, we're celebrating America 250, which is the birthday of the Declaration of Independence, but this all got started even earlier than a year before, but most critically or sort of emphatically at the Battle of Lexington and Concord, which began the 19th of April. So I'm just going to go through some slides here and talk to you a little bit about the book, and then very much open it for questions. Cindy mentioned there were books I'm happy to sign afterwards if anybody would like. I just wanted to very briefly, Cindy mentioned my previous books, because I often get the first sort of question, you've written about sports, you've written about baseball figures, why Paul Revere, why a historical figure? And, we're writing about people who do things, and it's not really, books are sold as sports books or history books, but they're books about things. So in 56, which is about Joe DiMaggio, for example, that takes place in the summer of 1941, which was called then the last innocent summer before we went to the war. He was an Italian-American hero, not named Al Capone, it was complicated to be an Italian-American hero at that time. So the book has a lot of history in it, and it's also very much about a man meeting a moment in DiMaggio, which is very much what Revere did. Revere was 40 years old on the night of the ride, and if he had not responded to the call in the way that he did, things would have been very different. So it was on the 18th of April that he went out. About 10 o'clock, he gets summoned to Joseph Warren's house, and 19th of April, beginning at dawn and throughout that day, is when the battles of Lexington and Concord occurred. Just back to the book, so Pete Rose has sort of a moral center to it, and certainly the social implications of Jackie Robinson are clear. That's a book about high school football and the dilemma around that. So I just point that all out to say that I felt very comfortable and sort of in continuum in writing about Revere in this way. This book is not meant to be all known thought about Paul Revere. It's not cradle to grave, every last thing. Things are done in service of the ride. So I tried to look at the book and tell sort of a narrative that could keep people going, pinning down to that night. One other interesting aspect about Revere, just something to think about, is, you know, he actually had a fairly long life. I mentioned he was 40 when he started this trip. He lived into his 80s. He's very active, ended up like being really important in rolling copper for the War of 1812 and many other things. But we know him for one event. And there aren't really a lot of historical figures. If I was here to talk about George Washington or Thomas Jefferson or any other number of people who had a much larger and broader impact on the founding of the country and the development of the country, there are many different things that I could talk about. Revere did other things, but we know him for that one thing. In the way, you know, there's Pheidippides who ran from Marathon to Athens, and we have the marathon from him. There's Rosa Parks, who we know for one act. Neil Armstrong. I mean, there's a few, but there's not a lot of people who are really sort of known by everybody and attached to a single act. So that was a really important part of thinking about Revere and thinking about how much, you know, he knew what time it was when it came to make that ride, right? He knew in his own life as 40-year-old with his family, and he knew what time it was in this audacious, ridiculous thing that they were going to try to do. A bunch of farmers with their fowling pieces were going to try to take on the best funded, best organized military in the world. So that's just sort of setting up where we are. This is the bell at the Old North Church in Boston. Now, I said that it's not cradle to grave, this book, and it certainly isn't, but I did certainly spend a little time trying to bring to light the man, who was the guy who would risk everything that he risked, do what he did on the night of April 18th. This is the bell. Revere grew up in North End of Boston. The Old North Church is the same church where the two lanterns were hung to signify that shown, to show that the British were going to come over the Charles River in 1775. When he was about 15, Revere took a job as a bell ringer at the Old North Church. And this church is still there today, and these bells are still there today. And change bell ringing is a very beautiful thing that some of you may know. But you have a series of people, in this case it was 8, and that's kind of a common number, who ring a bell according to a prescribed pattern. It's almost symphonic. It's lovely. And he was with a group of 7 other boys about his age, several of whom he would continue to know as he became like part of the Sons of Liberty and as they began to strategize for the oncoming revolution. And what was interesting to me about why I included this is they had sort of a pact and a covenant together. It was very close. They agreed they were going to do X, Y, and Z. They wouldn't beg for money from people. Nobody else could come into their little circle of bell ringers without a vote and such like, which is very similar to the kind of activity he did later. And the other thing is that, you know, when you ring a bell, still today, but certainly then, at a church, you're signifying that something's happening. Maybe there's a wedding, or there's been a death, or there's a service. You're asking people to come up, maybe there's a meal, come up and act and respond and do something. And that felt very close to what Revere, of course, did on the night of April 18th. He's asking people to, now's the time to get up and do something. This is the Green Dragon Tavern. Revere was a Mason, so he, and I don't mean by profession, I mean he was part of the Masonic Society, a Freemason. He was a silversmith, and when he was in his early 20s, he got involved in the Freemasons. It was already then a social group. It had nothing really to do only distantly with actually being a Mason, which is how it started in Scotland centuries before. And he really joined here as a way to meet people and to say, hey, I've got the silversmith business, and sort of, you know, drum up business. It turned out to be really critical. The Masons this is where they met at the Green Dragon Tavern, and this is where Revere met Joseph Warren, and Joseph Warren was one of the key sort of, if you take 4 figures, and I'm sure there are other people could mention, but really John Hancock, Joseph Warren, Samuel, and John Adams were the 4 guys at that part of the in that part of the country and at that time who were the engines of getting the revolution going. And Revere met Warren. That turned out to be an incredibly important friendship for him. Revere would later name one of his sons, Joseph Warren Revere. It helped shape Revere's thought, his commitment. And these Masons were incredibly involved in all the things that led up to the ride and led up to the Battle of Lexington and Concord, including, of course, the Boston Tea Party, which was in 1773. And you know that the Masons were involved because that night at the Masonic meeting, there was nobody signing in for attendance because they were all on the boats in Boston Harbor relieving them of the tea. So it was a critically important social group for Revere to be involved with. Here he is. There's one portrait of Paul Revere. There's actually others of him. I mentioned he lived into his 80s. There's others of him as a much older man. He's in his mid-30s. And when there's essentially one portrait of Paul Revere, and you're writing a book about Paul Revere, you spend a lot of time looking at that portrait. And the first thing you notice about it is that it's not Jack Black. It takes a little while for that to sink in, but it's not Jack Black. There are other things about the portrait which are very telling. So it was Jonathan Singleton Copley did the portrait, and I'm telling you, half the talks I say Copley, half the talks I say Copley, so feel free to correct me either way. Let's go with Copley for today, shall we? He was America's most famous portrait artist and best portrait artist, and he painted pictures of John Hancock, the Adams did, of Thomas Gage, who was the leader of the British forces in America, of wealthy people, of clergy, of the wives of wealthy men. Very unusual for him to do a simple artisan, a silversmith, such as Revere. And Revere may have had to barter for it to get it done because it was very expensive. Revere was fine making a living, but he wasn't particularly wealthy. You see that there's no accident there's a teapot there. This is before the Tea Party, but it's after the tax has been levied on the tea. And you know, when I would look at this portrait and come back to it, I would always say, he's winking. No, he's not winking. He's winking. It's like the way you think a yield sign is yellow, right? Like no matter how many times you know it's red and why you think it's yellow. I kept thinking he was winking. And it made me feel his attitude come through the portrait, particularly also the way he has his hand like that. Now, I don't know how many of you pose for your family portrait with your hand like that, and no judgment if you do. But Revere he was winking at us by doing that. He was not all that. The guys who I mentioned, Hancock, Adams, Warren, these were all guys who went to Boston Latin or Roxbury Latin. They went to Harvard, educated men. Hancock was the wealthiest man in the colonies at that point. They all had, Warren was a significant doctor. Adams were important political figures. Revere was, as I said, an artisan. His father came over here in 1715, a Frenchman named Apollos Rebois, and he became a tradesman and worked with his hands. He was not of that class, and he never was. And he always knew that. You know, America was trying to strain against sort of the class system of British, but it was very, very, very present in colonial America. And so he does this thing, and there's other parts of his personality that I get into. He's kind of saying, listen, I'm not all that, right? I'm posing here for this picture, but I see you. So it's a nice little window into who he was. This is a portrait of the Boston Massacre, and it's probably the second most famous thing that we would know about Paul Revere, or many of you, I'm sure, have seen this engraving. Revere didn't paint it. He did engrave it, and it was this engraving that went into the Boston Gazette, the Virginia Gazette, lots of different papers. So I mentioned he was a silversmith. He had other jobs, engraving as well. He was actually a dentist for a while. He was a self-trained dentist, which isn't the kind of dentist I would necessarily go to first, but you took what you could get in those days. When this came out, this is based on, of course, a real event where, so in 1768, already there had been some unrest in the colony, plenty of unrest, I should say. Just to level set, so the French and Indian War, which went for 15 years here, through the 1750s. During that war, the British from England and they would call themselves British, but the Americans here fought side by side against the French, right? George Washington fought alongside, literally, Thomas Gage. And so that's not that long ago, right? And not that long before these events started happening. And the British decide, listen, we kind of saved you all from the French. Every single weapon in the French and Indian War and in the start of this, the Revolutionary War, was made and created in London. There was no capacity for that here, right? Meaning weapons of war. There was some like sort of hunting guns and stuff here. And they said, listen, we paid for the whole war, we financed it, things were not great in London. And they said, we need to tax you, we need to get some money back, we need some stuff. Not a completely unreasonable request, but the colonists were not having it. And they also weren't having it that the British then started in 1768, they sent over a bunch of ships with lots of redcoats who would essentially occupy Boston. Boston was a city of about 16,000, and at its height, there were about 4,000 redcoats and British officers and British soldiers. So think about it, that's like one in five, right? And there was one day, and so therefore there was a lot of tension. And some of the officers behaved well, and some didn't behave well. And there was a square in the north end of Boston where a whole bunch of colonists were really egging on and trying to rile these British soldiers, throwing rocks at them, goading them. And the British soldiers, after a period of time, turned and opened fire on them. And that's the Boston Massacre. 5 people were killed. The most famous is probably Crispus Attucks. And so this is true that this happened, but it sort of portrays, it makes it look as if they just kind of walked into the square and started firing. Definitely a bit of propaganda that Samuel Adams is very much behind and others. The people wanted to get out there. Because as I mentioned, it was an audacious thing to have people rise up against the British. That's all they knew. They've been very close with people in the same family, supported either the crown or supported the rebellion. So it was an important part of propaganda to try to get people on board. Here we get to the ride itself. Let's see how much room I have here. So many of you probably know Boston, but if you don't, or just as a reminder, you can see sort of the big white area is Boston, and the north end, and the black square is Revere's route, the northernmost in this image. And you can see he had to cross the Charles River and then go on his way out, Bedford, Lexington, Concord. The red bubbles in the middle is the British Army. That's the Royal Army. That's how they went out. Also over the Charles River. That's the sea as it was called in the poem. And they also went that same route. And then the green on the bottom, that's William Dawes, who was another rider who also went out that night. I'm going to get to him a little bit more in a minute. There's a chapter on him in my book. But those were the only 2 riders who left from Boston that night. Both of them dispersed by Warren. Joseph Warren still lived in Boston. Why were they going to Lexington and Concord? So, in Lexington is where John Hancock and Samuel Adams were now staying. They lived in Boston, but things just got too hot. It was getting a lot of conflict with the British. Vandals would come and vandalize Hancock's home. They thought they might be arrested. So a few weeks before the middle of April, they moved out to Lexington. They held a provincial congress not far from there, and that's where they were. And in Concord, what was valuable there was a lot of military stores there. And by that I mean there was weaponry, gunpowder, cannon, but there was also like tents and axe handles and salted beef and bandages and the things you might need for a sustained battle. And they were concerned that the British were going to go and try to A, take and arrest Hancock and Adams, and B, go to Concord and get as many of those supplies as they could. So that's why that was predicted as the route. There's a lot of intelligence going back and forth. On the day, a few days before the 18th of April in 75, Revere had gone out to Lexington, and now he comes back, and he comes back through Charlestown, And he realizes that there's a good chance he might not be able to get out should the British go on their march there. And that's when Revere came up with the idea of hanging the lanterns in the Old North Church, which we'll come back to. He didn't actually do it, but it was his idea. The Somerset. So you saw the route that Revere took. The first thing he had to do was get out of Boston. Can't do that on a horse over the river, right? He had to do it by boat. A couple of days before this, the British had brought all the small boats in on the harbor and were gearing up. The city would get completely under curfew, shut down after darkness, or after about 9 or 10, and because they didn't want people to go out. And they specifically didn't want Paul Revere to go out once they began their march. They didn't, because they knew exactly who he was. Everybody knew Paul Revere's name, certainly in the colonies here. They knew his name in London, they knew his name in Edinburgh. And there was no accident that Revere became the principal rider this night. So in about the 1750s, just give you a little brief history on the express riders. If you wanted to get a letter from Boston to New York, you wrote it, and you gave it to somebody who came down in a horse and buggy or a sulky or whatever, and it took about a week or a week and a half, and they might pick up other letters on the way. They take the Boston Post Road. I don't know where we are exactly, but it can't be that far from here. And then somebody would write a letter and bring it back. Adams, in the late 1760s, Samuel Adams, put together a series of what he called express riders. And these were when it absolutely positively had to get there overnight. Okay? And these were single horsemen who would take information of British activity, maybe health-related things. Most often it dealt with British activity, but it could be other like important governmental or process information. And Revere was the best they had. He was the single best express rider in the fleet. And it wasn't just because he was good on the back of a horse, which he was. It was because he knew how to give information. John Adams said in a letter, simply, Paul Revere will give you the news. And it seems like a simple thing, but it's not really. Like, he knew to come, and he didn't come to your house and say, Bill, how's the wife? How are the kids? Everything good? The cow, the heifer's doing all right? No, he came and he told you what he needed to tell you, gave you the information, didn't dilly-dally, and was also able to respond if you had questions. Wait, what's going on? What's happening at the powder house or whatever it might be? Because you often couldn't carry a document. There were a couple times when he did, but you didn't want to be carrying documentation of anything, because if you were stopped or arrested, it would be treasonous. So he had to keep it all in his head, be efficient, be responsible. And it's not quite as simple as it sounds. So with Revere, I mentioned he was their best express rider. After the Boston Tea Party, which he took part in, he was one of the people on the boat throwing the tea off. He rode down to Hartford, Philadelphia, New York to tell people what had happened. He had a key ride Revere did in the fall of '74 to go to the First Continental Congress. It was Revere who brought the Suffolk Resolve, which was a critically important document. He had a ride up to Portsmouth, New Hampshire in the fall-winter of '74, right before this. So he was an experienced horseman, and he was the person that they were looking out for. So he had to make it through here. And another reminder, too, of he could have or should have been stopped, really, right? That manned boat is there to prevent people from crossing. This, of course, is a painting and impressionistic, but I think it's actually doesn't quite do justice to how big that boat was. It was a 68-gun warship, and it was so large vis-a-vis the river there that it had to be warped in, so meaning pulled in by wires and ropes to get perpendicular. In other words, like it was too narrow for it to do a three-point turn kind of thing to get itself situated that way. So I think in reality it was even bigger and occupied a greater space there. Revere had to get by it, and that was the first step. You know, when you're doing a book, one regret about the book for me is I wish I'd started earlier, because by the time I got started, Paul was dead. And most of his friends were dead too. So I had to look for other ways to try to get as close as I could to the subject. And one of them was this boat. So the Somerset I've just described its role here. It had been in action for a while. It stayed in action throughout the Revolutionary War. 60 days later was the Battle of Breeds Hill, Battle of Bunker Hill, and the Somerset from the harbor fired on Breeds Hill during that. Then it stayed in action throughout the Revolutionary War and would basically go up and down the Cape and get out at certain points and go in and steal all the supplies it could from a town and get back in the boat. Until one night in 1778 when it shipwrecks just off the coast of kind of, for those who know, between Truro and Provincetown, right? That's kind of the, you know, the Cape is famously like this and kind of off the bend of the rest there. The people of Truro are delighted, right? And they come running down, they apprehend all the British people on boat, and then they burn the Somerset down to the waterline in an act of defiance. And there it stays until the 1970s when tidal patterns reveal this boat off the shore of Cape Cod, and people came down, these rangers came down and they cut huge pieces of wood, I mean like the size of pickup trucks, and took that boat out of the water, and they brought it on shore there. Now, every now and then, I think the last time was about 2022, tides will reveal like just a little bit of wood runners you can kind of see in the sand. Usually you can't see any evidence whatsoever. So I, of course, as I mentioned, I wanted to get close to this boat for whatever reason. I don't know, I just wanted to get close to it. And I went up to see it, and it's in a warehouse. It's like one of your garages. It's just that it's not air conditioned or controlled. It's just, it locked a simple key. The ranger unlocked the door, I went in. And there it is, it's in amazingly good shape. And I guess because it's probably underwater in sand for 200 years, so there was no oxygen on it. And you can go, and I was sitting and touching these like huge hunks of wood. I mean, I geek out about it, and with these huge tree nails, the trunnels that are that big, and had the initials of some guy who helped build this boat in 1740 in Plymouth, England, etched into it. So it's all kind of an amazing bit of history. So that's the Somerset. Oops, sorry. Hold on one second. Let me go back to it. Yeah. Okay, so I mentioned, and we've been talking about how there were other riders, right? And there's William Dawes on the left, as I said. He was the only other person to be dispatched from Warren that night. He went over Boston Neck, which is by land, the only way you could get off of Boston into that suburban area. And he also eventually made it to Lexington, but for reasons we're not really 100% sure about, it doesn't seem to be really alerting people. He wasn't that effective. And we know that because if you look at the sort of list and roll call of the people who were fought at Lexington and Concord, they don't come from the area that he went through. Also, just anecdotally, many people said, I got the notice from Revere or from somebody who Revere told or whatever it is, and we didn't get that from Dawes. Dawes also completely risked his life, went out with a great patriot, but he just didn't seem to have been effective. We'll come back to him in a minute. Now, one thing I want to say about Revere's ride is, so imagine there he is, it's the middle of the night on April 18th, people know in the countryside that there's some tension and something might happen. They have no idea when it's going to be or anything, right? He comes riding along, knocks on your door. Johnny, we're going to go take on the British, all right? I know you're in your pajamas. A lot of guys are going to be like, Paul, I'm good. I'm staying in. My wife and I were playing backgammon. But, so a lot of people, not necessarily everybody responded and went. Some people did, and other people got on their own horse and rode further out to, say, Lynn or Reading or other towns for people who know that area to deliver the news and tell people. So you can imagine by, say, a little before midnight and from then into the early hours, there were times when there was this kind of neural network of riders, maybe 24, 30 riders going through the countryside spreading the alarm. On roads, but they're also through meadows or wherever they could get. There wasn't as many roads. And when you think about, so the next morning is when the British get to Lexington, they meet some resistance there, they go on to Concord, a little more resistance there, then they start coming back, and by late morning, early afternoon, they're on their way back to Boston, and by now there are thousands, maybe as many as 3,000 colonists along what's known as Battle Road, just basically firing on them, kicking their butt. That's what happened. And there's no way that number of people could have come from a single horse alert, right? No matter how good he was, we'll get to the lanterns in a minute, even though some people saw the lanterns, all that. It needed a network of people. And those people, it's also people say, well, was it organized or not? And it was kind of organized-ish. There were militias, there were the Minutemen, but there were also just people who were there and happened to be out that night and got involved. And one of those is Samuel Prescott. So Revere gets to Lexington, tells Hancock and Adams what's happening. He thinks there's 800 British soldiers coming across. It turned out to be maybe close to 2,000. They're concerned, he's concerned, Revere, the reason why we know about Dawes initially is that Revere mentioned him in his report. Where's Dawes? Finally Dawes arrives. They take him into arrest, and then they go on to Concord. Along the way, very soon after they start, they run into Samuel Prescott, who joins them. Prescott was a young doctor, and he would, obviously, house calls is the way doctors operated in those days. And his father had also been a doctor in the area. And so he knew the area very well. And Revere said, come with us to help us alert people. And why did he do this? Well, I mentioned that everybody knew Revere's name. Pretty much everyone did. But practically nobody knew what he looked like, right? There's no TV. There's no picture in the newspaper. Nobody saw that portrait, right? So if some guy shows up and says, take off your nightcap and go and fight the British, you might think twice. But if it's a doctor who's been in your house or whose father's been in your house who you know, you're much more likely to respond. So he became an important person for them to have with them on the way. John Hancock's trunk. Another inanimate object that I spent some time with in doing this book. John Hancock, as I said, was extremely wealthy. When he moved out to Lexington, he had an entourage with him, including a valet, who stayed at nearby Buckman Tavern, near to where Hancock would sleep. And the valet, among other things, had in his charge this trunk. And the trunk was filled with papers, with strategies that they were thinking about, with information on who was a spy for the colonists, who they suspected to be a spy for the British, all kinds of designs. And they knew that this could not fall in the hands of the British, right? First of all, it would give them all this information, and it was completely treasonous, right? That would have been the end of John Hancock, right? So Revere, on his way to Concord, he and Dawes and Prescott get stopped and apprehended. On the day of the ride, hours before the soldiers went out, Thomas Gage, who was the general leading the British forces, sent out some scouts, including a group of about 8 riders who were together, basically to prevent people from coming along the road, spreading the word, all of that. They had already taken in somebody, and then they stopped and caught Revere and Dawes and Prescott. Revere is completely brash with them. He tells them exactly what's happening. Revere never said anything. He's like, what's going on? And they're like, he said, your men are coming across the water, and we're coming out here, and we're going to get our guns, and we're going to shoot you, basically, is what he said. But they also freak out a little bit, the British do, because they're in an area, it's not entirely colonists or loyalists, right? So it's just like today, in a sense, people could have different allegiances and live in the same town. But it's pretty heavily colonist in that area. And remember, not a shot has been fired. We're now talking about like wee hours of April 19th, 2, 3 in the morning. And both sides are hoping against hope that it's not going to be a war. They don't really want that, right? Even the Americans at that point, they weren't really talking about shaking off the crown, right? That only came more than a year later with the, Thomas Paine and then the Declaration of Independence, when it was like, hey, we'll totally break free. At this stage, it was still just like, we don't like being taxed without representation. We don't like that you're filling our court system with your appointees. We don't like you have all these soldiers quartering in our homes. We don't like what's going on. That was it. It wasn't expressly to break away. So there was still a sense on both sides, hope that a war wouldn't happen. When they realized that they got Paul Revere, that they kind of freaked out. They're like, he said, what's your name? He said, Revere. They were like, oh my God, Paul Revere. It's like kidnapping the wrong kid or something, right? Like, so they got nervous, and Revere, ultimately, they let him go. Because they didn't want to be like found with Revere. It would have lifted things, made things much more intense. They did steal his horse, a great horse named Brown Beauty, who went on to fight, I guess, to the British. We don't know what happened. Revere walks back to Lexington, goes right back into the breach, because he's concerned that Hancock and Adams won't leave, or won't leave quickly enough, Lexington. He goes back, sure enough, they're still there. Hancock is kind of polishing his gun. He wants to go out and take part, and they're all talking off the ledge. Revere convinces them time to go. They get into a sulky, and they head out to a town called Woburn, where they had another place they were going to stay. They realize, when they're getting close, that Hancock has forgotten the trunk. And we just lost Catherine O'Hara, but in Home Alone, when she's sort of like, Kevin! She realizes? Kind of like that. You can see him freaking out, the trunk! So Revere and Hancock's valet go back into Lexington. Hancock and Adams stay in Woburn and then move on from there. And get this trunk, which is upstairs in Buckland Tavern, and are carrying it out. And that's why Revere was on the green, on Lexington Green, in the early morning of April 19th when the first shot was fired. And that's why we first learned, got our first reports of Revere's ride, came right after that, because they deposed him. They wanted to get information about who fired the first shot. This gets back to neither side wanting to be responsible for escalating it. And so that was the first report we got from Revere and his first description of those nights. And one thing that's interesting too is that when he gave his description, he said, well, I stopped at just about every house on the way to Lexington. But he didn't say, I stopped at Bill's house, I stopped at the Carters, I stopped at the Williamses. You weren't given names, right? That was all, again, highly treasonous. Nobody wanted their name associated. So Revere was not going to say who was who. Yes, okay. Listen, my children, and you shall hear the midnight ride of Paul Revere on the 18th of April in 75. Hardly a man is now alive remembers that day and year. Longfellow's poem, he's why we're all here today. He's why everybody knows Paul Revere. If you were a student of American history, you would certainly have heard of Paul Revere without this poem. He was definitely known and chronicled, and as I said, he did other things throughout the war. But there's no way that everybody would know his name. There's no way that there would be no, I got the horse right here, his name is Paul Revere. There'd be no Beastie Boys Paul Revere song, no Noah Kahan Paul Revere song. There's a pizza place in Iowa called Paul Revere Pizza, known for its speed and reliability. All of that is because of Wadsworth, Longfellow's poem, which he wrote. I don't know if people know when he wrote it, but it was in 1860. Yeah, so it first appeared in 1861 in the Atlantic Monthly. That's when January 1861. And so that's 85 years later, right? And it was meant, Longfellow generally was not political in his writings at all, but he was very much against slavery. And it was written as a call for abolitionists, saying, stand up and act, this isn't right. And here's a hero from yesteryear, kind of, who stood up and did something by his own action. It was meant to inspire. And at that point, when Longfellow, he was the best known, best paid, most read poet in the world, right? So he'd already written Evangeline, he'd written Song of Hiawatha. When Dickens came to visit America, it was Longfellow who showed him around. So it was a really big deal and had a huge impact on Revere's legacy. And apart from children's poems, I think that this poem may be, along with Two Roads in the Yellow Wood, the most famous or well-known or continually known poem we had. And when doing this book, I had some scholars sort of complain that it wasn't 100% accurate, right? And he does take some liberties with the timing of it, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock to the rhythm. But basically, it is pretty accurate, right? And to me, it doesn't bother me at all. It's a poem. maybe Frost stood there and there were 3 roads diverging in the yellow wood. And he said, let's make it 2, everybody will understand that better. So it's a little bit of that, but hugely impactful. Okay. I mentioned there was only one portrait of Revere alive. There's been many paintings and depictions starting from back then till today, pretty much, of Revere's life. None of them are completely historical accurate. I like this one because of the light. It's just a reminder that, so it was a gibbous moon on the night that he went out, which means there was pretty good light, which you needed to see. There was no accident, right? It had rained a couple of nights before. The British needed to see where they were going. He, of course, needed to see where he was going. Also, the fact that there was some cloud cover, there wasn't as much light. That's a good part of this sketch that I like you to see. The other thing that's funny, though, is like, he wouldn't have been yelling, right? Like, half the people are on the other side. He's not yelling anything. He's coming quietly, and as I've described before, knocking on the door, maybe go to the door of a tavern and say, here's what's happening, we've got to move, and so like that. And, you know, and he also wouldn't have, he would have wanted to be careful to keep his profile low and to make good time as he was going. The horse he rode in those days, to those who know horses, it was a pacer, and he didn't have his own horse. He pretty much always borrowed or rented horses. And it wasn't necessarily the fastest horse there was, but it was really good on different terrains. It was only about 14 hands for people who know horses, so like the size of a pony today. Some of the British generals had 16-hand horses, but it was very durable. So when he would take a ride down to Philadelphia, say that's 350 miles. Now, of course, he's changing horses along the way. You can't take one horse out. But he's still getting 80, maybe 100 miles from a horse or whatever it is. And so they need to be durable and all of that. The Old North Church. There it is. So, you know, I mentioned a little bit of the reporting I did. When you're doing this kind of book, you go and explore whatever you can, right, in historical societies, and certainly the Massachusetts Historical Society, but also smaller museums, libraries, repositories of information. And what you're looking for is not just stuff written by Paul Revere, because that's great, but it's pretty limited, but anything that can help you sort of create the scene and get into what the world was really like. And I came across a bunch of somewhat contemporary sketches of the North End of Boston, including the Old North Church. And because of my reporting instinct, I wanted to go up there and see what it was like when they hung the light. Now, I should just, before I say this, I want you guys to know that I really do not like heights at all. As mentioned, I worked at Sports Illustrated for a long time, and I was once doing a story on a rock climber out in Yosemite. He was climbing El Cap, that big, and we're together in the valley, and we're actually on a different rock, kind of opposite-ish from El Cap. And he's talking to me, standing right on the edge like this, looking out and talking to the rock climber. And I'm back there in the parking lot. And I say, like, Chris, you know, I'd love to keep interviewing you, but I'm too nervous. I can't get that close. And he was incredibly sweet to me. He was like, I have that fear too. It's really important for a rock climber to have that fear. It keeps them from being, you know, getting sloppy. What I used to do is I'd lie down on my stomach and peer out that way. And I said, that's a great idea. So I lay down on my stomach, but I still stayed 30 feet back. I did not come half a step closer. So now it's years later, I decided I want to go up here. I have to get special dispensation. I don't know if people who've been, if you go on the Freedom Trail, you can go into here, anyone can basically go into the Old North Church, and as part of a tourist trip, you can go up kind of 2 regular staircases to the bell ringer's room. When I was describing the bell ringing, it's like a long rope that hangs down, so you're that far down. Anything beyond that, you need to get special dispensation. So I go and I make an appointment, and right before you go up, I have to sign a slip, and the guy's like, all right, listen, if you fall and you land inside the property, we'll take care of you. If you land outside the property, you're on your own. So I have that going for me. We begin our travel up. It's January and it's dark. I wanted to go at night when the lanterns were shown. And first it's just a couple of other staircases that are now kind of erratic, so uneven steps and just sort of a rope banister. Then you get up to where the bells are, and that was really cool. That bell I initially showed, same bells that have been there since 1750 that still ring on Sundays from the Old North Church. Then from there, it's like a series of ladders that go kind of back and forth in a little platform. This is terrifying. So I'm going up, and the guy's like kind of scampering in front of me. He says, like, don't look down. I don't look down. He says, don't look up. I don't look up. Keep going. When we get a little bit close to the top, there are some open windows. There's mesh to keep the pigeons out, which there weren't at the time, and Longfellow talks about the pigeons. But the wind is suddenly coming through, and it's cold, and it's making the sound, and I am crying almost. I'm just holding on. I'm thinking about people who've been through hard things in their life. If they can do it, I can do it, and all of that stuff. I get up to the belfry, and now suddenly I felt a lot calmer, a lot more secure. And you look at it, it's way different, of course, now than it was 250 years ago, right? There's cars honking on the street, there's traffic lights, there's a yoga class going on at the Y, all this stuff. But you can also see the bend in the river where Revere crossed. You can see the old graveyard that he talked about, the narrow streets that are there. And you have this real sense, which comes a lot when you're doing a book like this, that, hey, this isn't Paul Bunyan, it's Paul Revere. Like, this actually happened, a person did this. And of course we know that intellectually, but still it just can hit you at a certain time. And the other thing that struck me was, so I described my time going up there. The sexton of the church, a guy named Robert Newman, who was the person who Revere told and who was asked to go up, he had to do the same thing I did, obviously on much less secure and well maintained ladders in those days. He also had two heavy lanterns on a leather thong strapped on his neck. He had to get up there, he had a tinder box in his pocket, light the lanterns with enough time, and then he had to hold them out. And when he held them out first like that, and then separated this way. Because it was really to show people in Charleston and Cambridge, it's a pretty limited area that he would be able to see it, but that there were two, and if you just held out like that from that far away, it could just look like one light. And it's just a reminder that, things, and then you have to scamper down and get out and hide the lanterns before the British came, which they did, because just as, not that they would have known what the signal meant, but why is there suddenly light in the city's under curfew, nobody's supposed to be out, why is somebody showing a light in the Old North Church, right? And it's just a reminder, if they hadn't gotten the lanterns out, even though we know it was seen and responded to, everything might have still come off okay. It's not like it would have not happened, but it's still a reminder that things could have gone very differently. We just sort of expect, oh yeah, it's like, hey, go put the light on upstairs. And somebody ran up to put the light on. No, it was a lot more complicated, and it could have been a lot different. So yeah, now we're back to the front, and I can continue, but I think I'd like to open it up to questions if anybody has any thoughts, questions. I don't know if we're going to go around with the mic, or should I just... Okay. Yes, go right ahead, right?
I heard of the Pony Express, and I'm just wondering if he is a postal writer, if that led into the Pony Express, or...
Yeah, so the Pony Express, and I know that that's 1800s, right? Like it's later on in the 1800s and in the West. I don't know of any, horseback with how people got stuff around. So there's that connection. I don't know that there was any particular connection. Yes, right behind me.
I have a comment, just a comment. I'm Vicki Revere, sixth grade granddaughter of Paul Revere, and I want to congratulate you on your book.
That's incredible! Thank you! Oh, that's amazing. Thank you guys for coming.
Thank you for describing the walk up to the Old North Church.
Yeah.
Because I was told that I and my husband can go, but now I don't know.
Well, it's wonderful to meet you. I'll get to cover. I just want to say it's great. Thank you so much for coming.
Congratulations.
I took her to Boston for our 10th anniversary, so we went to the Revere house.
Great.
And I made a little, comment to the people there. I said, you guys realize that Paul Revere was a Yankee who warned everybody about the red coats.
Well, it's funny, in the South, they say Paul Revere, he's that Yankee who had to go ask for help. But one quick thing I just want to say on there, I did spend time with, I don't know if you know him, but Paul Revere, the the third is his name. He's a lawyer in Massachusetts. He's obviously not the third. He's the fifth great-great-great-grandson. But they weren't all called Paul. And he's from the Joseph Warren line. And I got to spend some time with him. They have like Paul Revere law services, you know.
She comes from the first line with Paul and Sarah. And the second line was actually who pretty much ended up with the inheritances.
So before you get to the next question, one thing I wanted to say, he had 16 kids.
Oh, yeah.
Only 11 of them survived into adulthood. He had 2 wives, 16 kids. So people asked if he said, like, the British are coming, which he didn't say that.
The regulars are out.
But regulars are out, is what he said. So the British, he didn't say the British are coming, but if he had 16 kids, somebody was coming. Let's get that straight. Go ahead.
I'm a history teacher, and I'm just thrilled to be close to you. This is so exciting for me. You said that he had a group of friends, the bell ringers. Do you know any of those boys who later became men that he stayed in touch with?
Yes, and I have to, it's in the book, and so I just don't want to misspeak.
Okay,
I don't remember
okay.
everything. But there was a group of 8 of them, and they rang the bell in that church. And one of them, Jonas, I'm just forgetting his name, went on to be a musician and a painter and engraver. There were 2 or 3 of them who were still in life in 1775 and became involved in Sons of Liberty. Others we don't really know for sure.
And then, last question. What was Paul's reaction when Dr. Joseph Warren was, gunned down during the battle?
Yes, that's a good one. And for those who might not have heard, when Joseph Warren, as I mentioned, he was this leader, but he was determined to fight like an ordinary soldier in the Battle of Bunker Hill, which is where he was killed. And the British despised him because they thought he was the leader of the uprising, and they really did a number on his body and put it into a shallow grave. And soon after, it was Revere. Revere had, I mentioned, dental work, and Revere had put a wooden tooth into Warren's mouth at some point, and so Revere was the one who was brought down to identify Warren's body. And then soon after, when he had the son, he named Joseph Warren Revere. Okay, we have a couple here. Yes, right here.
Can you give us a sense of the timing? I realise he's riding, presumably as fast as he can, but he's also stopping lots of times to spread the news. How long is it going to take to get from Boston?
Good question. How long will it take? So I talked earlier about some of his longer rides, like, the overnight ride to Portsmouth is 65 miles or so. The ride down to Philadelphia, that's at 350 miles. Here, Lexington is maybe 12 to 14 miles out. You can drive the route today, although you pass like a mobile station and a Dunkin', so that's exciting. But, so we don't know exactly how long it took. That's why, Longfellow used to provide some meter, gave a progression. It might not be inaccurate, but we don't know if it's accurate. But let's say a couple of hours or so. He got the word from Warren. We're pretty much sure that's about 10 o'clock. He had to go get across the river, wait for a horse, right? He couldn't text ahead and say, I'll be there, get the horse ready. So prepare a horse, get him to go. And we know that at some point after midnight, say maybe between 12 and 1 or so, is when he got to Lexington. And you're right, that's part of what made him, again, a good rider. Not that, it's a unique talent, but it's not a talent that everybody has, to be efficient in getting the word out, but to keep moving, right? And so that was the key part. Yes, anyone else? Over here, yes. Sir, yes.
There was a mini-series that came out in the last few years. The name of it escapes me, but it was basically this whole time frame. The interesting thing is, with the exception of the guy that played Paul Revere and the guy that played Joseph Warren, all the actors are British. Okay? It was a really good mini-series. One of the questions I have for you, because you said that Hancock was living far away, and this series points out why Sam Adams left because he was wanted. But in this series, it showed that the military governor kicked Hancock out of his house and took his house from him. Okay? That was one of the reasons I think it's the Fourth Amendment and no quartering. So would that have been the reason that he went out to Lexington?
And as far as there was a sort of destruction time where Hancock's house was overtaken a couple of years before this.
Yes.
But then it was restored to Hancock, and he had his house and was living there. I'm not sure actually what happened after. Once the war was full blown, pretty much anybody on the colony side was out of Boston, and it was a totally British stronghold. And I imagine they had Hancock's house and Warren's house and anybody's under
It
control.
wasn't pointed out in that series when the house was taken over that Hancock eventually got back a couple years later.
And my understanding is that he did get back, but I'm not sure if he ever got back from when he left here. He left very specifically because they weren't out in Lexington, which is again 12, 14 miles away, but very long. They were there for a matter of weeks. Before that, he had his house. But he felt, to your point, he felt under duress. Thomas Gage is the British commander, right? And he felt a whole other aspect. He felt two ways about a lot of things. So he was the one who said, look, we can't just go in. I'm not sure what the series said, but my understanding is that he did not at all order Hancock's house to be possessed. That people did that within the ranks, right? And they made that decision. And he said, no, we can't do that. We're not taking it that far. I think you had something.
Yes, I did. We have Mystic Seaport right up the road
Sure.
here. And I'm just wondering why the Somerset hasn't been taken there to be restored or at least sheltered.
Well, it doesn't, the guy said that technically it belongs to the British. They haven't come asking for it. I don't know how well you could really restore. I mean, you could certainly use those timbers and make some kind of replica, but a lot of it is gone. Yeah, it's true. Yes.
Is there any evidence of women or young girls being involved in the network of writers or preparing books?
Not among the riders, but there were very important women. One of whom was Rachel Revere, who was the second wife. So I mentioned he had all those kids. He was married to one woman, had 8 children. She died shortly after childbirth. And then he married another woman and had 1 child, would go on to have 8, but at this point had 1 child with the night of the ride. So while on that night, while Paul was out riding around with his friends, Rachel was home taking care of 5 children and her mother-in-law. So she was the real hero of the Apart from that, Margaret Kimball Gage is an important figure, and I get into her a little bit in the book. She's the wife of Thomas Gage. And Gage was British, of course. She was not. She was born in America. He was very smitten with her, loved her. She had long lines in America. And when the rebellion was beginning, she said to Thomas Gage, and I want to point out, Gage, as we've been talking about here, he felt sympathy. He fought alongside the Americans. He felt allegiance to America. He did what he had to do, but he also wasn't as sort of cutthroat or killer instinct as somebody else might have been. And when things were heating up, Margaret Kimball Gage said to her husband, I hope you won't do anything that will hurt my countrymen, right? And by that she meant the Americans. When the war, and I'm going to explain why she was important, when it started beginning, Margaret Kimball Gage expressed great lament to a friend of hers, and compared herself to a character named Blanche in Shakespeare's King John. And Blanche, in those days, I guess people knew Shakespeare the way we know the 50th season of Survivor. But Blanche is complaining in this war in Scotland that her father is on one side, I might have this wrong, so please check it, but her father is on one side, her uncle is on another, her brother, and she's lamenting. She said, if I win, I lose, if I lose, I win, I'm sad, I'm doubly yoked in politics. And Margaret Kimball Gage compared herself to this. We found out soon after this all happened that Samuel Adams had gotten a tip from somebody a couple days before that the British were thinking about coming out. We didn't know exactly when, exactly where, but a little bit more information. And it turned out that came from a woman who was, quote, doubly yoked in politics. And there weren't a lot of people who had access to even get something to Samuel Adams. And then this description of her, there's a lot of people who felt that it was her who had been given this information. And in August of that year, so this is April, Bunker Hill is in June, in August of that year, Margaret Kimball Gage was sent back to London while Thomas Gage stayed here. So she certainly had a role in giving information at that time, but there were no women writers in the network at that time. There was a woman named Sybil Luddington, and maybe some of you know her name, who incredible story of a woman in Connecticut who was 16 years old, I believe, and went in, I think it was 1778, and warned about troops coming towards Danbury. The only thing is that it's probably apocryphal. She got a stamp, she got a statue, but historians have shown that she never once mentioned it in her lifetime, even when she appealed for reparations for like war efforts. She never said it. It was only literally about well after her death, like many decades, that it came up in some history story. So there's not a lot to be said there. It's an amazing story, nonetheless. Somebody else, yes, in the green there.
You mentioned that Revere was so well known by the British, even in England. Why didn't they just arrest him? They knew he was dangerous. Why didn't they just arrest him?
Well, there are a couple of things. First of all, they didn't even arrest Samuel Adams or John Hancock. They didn't really arrest anybody, partly because of the tension that would bring. Now instead of like game on, we're arresting people. Also, it's not entirely clear that what Revere was doing. Yes, it's got to be illegal under he's spreading treasonous information. But for instance, when he went to deliver the Suffolk Resolve, say, to First Continental Congress, he's just bringing a message. He didn't divide the resolves as sort of a way to bring the country to the edge of war. Or when he went to Portsmouth, he was giving warning that they thought the British troops were coming to take military stores in Portsmouth. So he wasn't, I'm sure you could make a case if you wanted to, but he wasn't the worst criminal of the bunch, right? There were other guys like strapping on guns and engaging. So, but it's a good question. It comes up sometimes. There was never any inclination that anybody was going to be arrested until, really ever, but certainly not until after the war officially began. There in the blue.
Can you say approximately how long the lanterns were physically shown in the sequel?
So, and I try to be clear in the book, like, I know what I know, and I guess as best as I can, and I guess best I can. We don't really know, but maybe a minute, maybe 90 seconds. Again, it would have stuck out. Anybody could have seen it, so it wouldn't have been that long. But they had people in Charleston who every night in that time were looking out to see if they would see it. So we think that it's about that. Certainly not more than a few minutes.
What time of night?
So what time? It was a little after 10, between 10 and 11 at some point. Yeah. Sorry, over there. Yes.
On his ride, did he have any idea who were colonists and who were loyalists?
Say it one more time. Sorry.
Did he have any idea when he was doing his ride who were colonists and who were loyalists?
Did Revere when he was telling people?
Yeah, knock on doors.
So he had some idea, certainly in the area around, but he didn't always know. And he may have actually in the ride to Portsmouth. I said one thing about Revere, you asked him a question, he told you a straight answer. He may have told somebody on the loyalist side who said, hey, what are you doing? He's like, well, the British are coming to try to take the stores and I want to alert people. He just told people, and I think he did the best he could, but sometimes he was wrong. We have one over here, yes, in the back.
There's a lot written about Paul Revere and this time in history. What made you decide to do this book that would set it apart from all the other things that have been written about that time in history of Paul Revere?
Yeah, it's a great question. So personally, I'll just say I had an affection. I remember read this poem when I was maybe 8 or 9. Well old enough to read, but still loved being read to. I read the poem out of this red, big volume of poetry that had no picture. That turned out to be important because it let me to imagine it the way any of you might imagine it. So it sort of had a dancing in my head. But I felt like, so I'm a historian and I've done that throughout my books, but I'm also a journalist, a really good journalist first. And I didn't really want to do an academic book. The books that are out there on Revere, and it's a very good one. There's a wonderful one by Esther Ford, which came out in 1942, and it's still, to me, the best book. They're a little more academic in nature, and they are trying to give every last thing. I feel like I came up with a few pieces of information that weren't out there, but really I was trying to just marshal this into an exciting story, a story about a particular thing that could be a little more accessible. That's what appealed to me as a writer, and I hope for readers. So it was really that.
Can I add something to that? Did you find anything in your research of it that really surprised you more than anything else about Paul Revere and
Yeah, there were, I guess, two things. One, on a smaller level, what I was just talking about with Margaret Kimball Gage had been certainly brought to the surface before, not by me, but I felt like I found an understanding of it and some aspects of it that hadn't been said or revealed before, so that was satisfying, I guess. I think the biggest thing is that I mentioned early on how these were really educated people in Hancock and the Adamses, and they were also people who've been here a long time. Most of them had long lines already to the mid-1600s being here. Revere was, as I said, an immigrant, and he wasn't of that class. And the fact that he got so close, you know, a guy who didn't go to college, he just went to a technical grade school, that he got so close on this night and just in general in the plaza and was so trusted by the people who really organized and ran and got the revolution off the ground. That was what I guess the biggest realization. I hadn't realized like how big of a class difference there was. Like Revere, they trusted him, and like, he was the one doing their bidding, right? He was the one who would go, take his ride, come back, say, here's what I spent on a horse, here's what I spent overnight, here's my time, and they'd pay him. He was a rider for hire, right? Who achieved this sort of great stature and this great influence. And to me, that was a realization that was important.